Hey everybody, it's Gus with Egypt Adventures Travel. Today's video is a little bit different because I have three guests with me who actually went to Egypt with me a couple of years ago. I planned and organized their trip, and then Mark, one of the guys from the group, actually wrote a book based on his trip in Egypt and then a journey that he did, visiting all of the obelisks that have moved outside of Egypt and gone around the world to various cities. On this video, we're going to be talking about the trip that these three guys took to Egypt a couple of years ago. And then Mark's going to share what led him to write his book and some interesting facts about the obelisks that are in Egypt and the ones that have moved abroad. Before we jump into talking about their trip, I want the three guests with me on the call to introduce themselves. So we're going to start with Dana. I want you to share your name, where you're from or where you live, and how you know the other guys in the group.
Hello, thank you, Gus. Thanks for letting us be here. My name is Dana Snyder. I do voices for cartoons. I live in Burbank, California. And Mark is my father-in-law. And Kasser is my father-in-law's friend. Also, side note, before, you know what today is? Does anyone know? Gus, I would think you would know. Today is the day in 1922 they discovered the entrance of King Tut's tomb.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Fortuitous for this recording.
Yep, 102 years later. I love that.
Yeah,
All
side
right.
note. That was just a side factoid.
I love it. All right, Kasser.
Yeah, I'm Kasser Sharif. I live in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. and Silver Spring, Maryland. And ages ago, Mark and I have worked for the same company. We're both retired from there. And while we interacted over the course of our work, most of all, we have taken several interesting trips together to many interesting places, on some of which Dana also came along. So initially I knew Dana as Mark's son-in-law. I now know him as also a friend of mine. That's kind of me.
And I'm Mark Ciccone. I live in Boston, and you heard how I'm related to these two guys. Dana, when you said what happened 102 years ago, I thought you were going to say it was my birthday. But I'm obviously.
I was trying to keep you private. I didn't want to out you on that.
But we've traveled together and we have a great time. We yell at each other, we laugh, we cry. We just have a really interesting time. They're guy trips, or what we go to places where our wives really say that it's okay to go alone without us.
Yeah, I love that. And I loved planning your guys' trip a couple of years ago to Egypt. And I love that now, Mark, this has turned into something that's a passion project for you in doing all this research on obelisks and writing your book. But before we start talking about that, I want to talk about the trip that you guys took to Egypt a couple of years ago and hear about your experiences and maybe hear some stories about some of the things that you guys did.
I mean, well, I'm sort of why we found you, because I had a
Yes.
friend who had, I think they had worked with you. And then I started watching. I was getting very excited about the potentiality of taking this trip. And your videos were in no small part helping with that. And then I sort of talked to the guys and said, hey, this guy, we just give him money, this you've never met, and he will help us meet someone we don't know. But you were very, it was a great process. I feel like also you were not ready for what was going to happen with these two guys when it was the trip planning of the list was like, no, we're doing this and then this and then this. And you were like, oh, normally people do half that much. Like, no, we're doing, these guys know what, these are power players. They know what they want. They go right in. I was just there for the ride. I stepped aside, said, just tell me when and where to show up, and I'll do it.
Gus, I'd been to Egypt maybe 3 or 4 times before this trip. They were always, or most of them were business trips, usually to Cairo, most of the time in the office, maybe some dinners in a hotel in the evening. And I'd taken a little side trip once or twice to the Pyramid of Giza, but really hadn't seen much beyond that. I have several friends who had been to Egypt and had different kinds of stories about how the trip went, and really none of them were very enticing to me. Either it was a huge, complete package tour, start to finish, 15 days, they tell you what you're going to do when you can scratch your nose, etc., etc., or it was chaos. I have some friends who told me that most of their time was spent waiting for transport to arrive, which
Mhm.
sometimes did and sometimes didn't. And I told them, if you had talked to Gus before you went, you may have avoided all of the waiting for transport to arrive or trying to figure out. So it was really a different kind of trip. Mark already said that. As soon as I told my wife that Mark and I and maybe Dana are going on a trip, she said, I'm not coming, because she knew exactly the kind of trip that would be. I mean, one of the things that we have in common, which has made these trips very interesting, is interest in history, interest in archaeology, interest in culture. So those are the things that really we have. And we spent a lot of time, very serious time, on these trips, exploring all of those things in a fun way, not in a academic way, even though this resulted in a book by Mark, which is extremely good, and even from an academic point of view, really good. So that's sort of how I got into this.
Yeah, and these guys, just to give my viewers a little context, they hired me to do a customized itinerary, and then I got them connected with one of my vetted and trusted Egyptian partners. So I put together the whole customized plan. Like Dana said, they wanted to fit a ton of stuff into their trip to Egypt, so we fit it all in there. And then I connected them with one of my partners who took care of all the local logistics. And I actually bumped into you guys in Alexandria. That was really just fun and unexpected. I think it was the Library of Alexandria
Yep, at the library.
where I saw you guys
You
at.
were right by the bookmarks
Yep,
in the
yep. I
gift
remember
shop.
seeing you, yeah, at
Yeah.
the bookshop.
We saw you. It was like we were seeing a celebrity in person. It was like George Clooney. What we were like, wait, that's Gus.
I love that.
It was a fury of excitement walking out that we ran into you.
Now it usually happens maybe 2 or 3 times every trip to Egypt where somebody comes up to me on the street or at the pyramids or in a restaurant and they say, "Hey, are you Gus from YouTube?" And they take a picture with me or they say thank you for all the advice for travel to Egypt. So yeah, I love it when I see people, especially when it's my guests where I plan their trip. And I always say I see you out in the wild, so to speak. Yeah. Well, before we jump into talking a little bit more about Mark's book, I want to hear from Dana and Casser just quickly, like what was your favorite activity you did, or what's a funny memory or a funny story, or what's something just that stood out about your time in Egypt that you want to share?
Several things, really hard to say which one. Um, I'd been to the pyramid before, so I knew a little bit what to expect and so on. But really, the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, Luxor Temple, Karnak Temple, all of those were, in terms of scale, beyond what I had expected, beyond what I had thought in my mind. So that was sort of one thing. And then there are a few little things. We took this felucca tour on the Nile. I think that must have been in Aswan, if I remember correctly. And these kids swimming around our little felucca boat and coming up and trying to chat with us and so on. That was kind of a fun thing. Um, there's several other things like that. There's this small town we went to, and this has really stuck with me when we were driving from Cairo to Alexandria. And I think it's called Wadi al Natrun, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It's an ancient, a village or a small town inhabited by from ancient times, Coptic Christians, and
Yep.
that was very interesting to me. It really was, because it was different from. It was not ancient Egypt that we were looking at there, even though their heritage goes back many centuries. So that was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Dana, how about you?
I mean, the Valley of the Kings was spectacular. That was fantastic. It's amazing. I mean, to be able to see fingerprints and the brush strokes of the things painted on there and know they were longer than I can almost comprehend. I also like just being in the city of Cairo. I mean, to see a big, humongous city, but that's, 20% different in every way from what I'm used to. I also took, before I met up with the guys, a food tour the first day in Cairo. And that was great because it was all these little nooks and crannies and just sort of walking around.
Yeah. And
All of it was spectacular, though. I was not prepared. I think it was my favorite place I've ever been Everywhere we went in Egypt, there was a transformative trip.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you guys for sharing all of those moments, and Wadi Nathrun especially is just a beautiful, beautiful place. Like Casser was saying, the Coptic Orthodox Christian history and heritage there, and the monasteries are beautiful. And yeah, Dana, I love that you got to do a food tour in downtown Cairo, which is the place in Egypt to try street food and local, like koshery and falafel and all of that. So that's great. Well, now, Mark, I want to transition to talking about your book, Obelisk Odyssey, and kind of how you got the idea to write a book from your experiences on the trip.
And my traveling partners have asked me the same thing because they had no idea that I thought of writing a book during this whole trip. And I didn't. It was really kind of as the trip progressed, something really started to strike me almost subconsciously, I think. And that were the obelisks. The trip wasn't organized around seeing obelisks. They're in some ways a little bit of an afterthought because, as my colleagues were saying, it's the Sphinx, the pyramids at Giza, Luxor. That's what Americans want to see. Mm-hmm. But, there were 4 stops that we made, and I'll go through them really quick, Gus, that kind of, I think, incrementally got me interested in obelisks. The first was on our first day in Aswan. And a lot of your viewers have probably been to Aswan. It's where lots going on there, but it's where the granite quarries are. That is where all of the obelisks came from. And on our first day, we walked on the unfinished obelisk. And what that is, it would have been the biggest obelisk in the world, but it never got erected because it developed a crack. It would have been half a football field high, 2,000 tons. Imagine that, 3,500 years ago. But now you can walk in on top of it in the quarry, and you can just see it's explained how all the men for generations after generation would sit on that rock, on the granite, and carve out with these basaltic rocks, little by little, whittling away, creating these huge monuments and hieroglyphs, etc. So that kind of blew me away. That it all came from this one kind of little quarry. Then the next day, we went up to Luxor and we drove up there. We didn't go by boat. We wanted to make as quick time as we could. And I saw my first obelisks that were standing upright. And these were the 2 in front of the Temple of Karnak. And they have a sound and light show, and it's just fabulous. And it dawned on me, they had to get these obelisks from Aswan, 300 miles south, all the way downriver to Karnak, get them off the boat, drag them inland, and re-erect them. And it's driven scholars crazy for years exactly how that happened. But there was a whole shipping element to this thing. Also, one of the 2 obelisks was created by Hatshepsut, somebody I had never heard of, a pharaoh. And it turns out that relatively recently, only in the 1800s, it was determined that she was a she. Mm-hmm. It was a queen, not a pharaoh. One of maybe the earliest example of a female head of state in the history of the world. So that kind of made it a little contemporary for me. Then the third stop was a couple hundred miles north from there in Cairo. And we got to Cairo, and as Dana said, it's this mega city, 25 million if you include Giza, et cetera, et cetera. It blows your mind. And right in the center of it is an obelisk in Tahrir Square, which is Liberty Square. And there I saw an obelisk that was in the center of a modern society. It wasn't in Aswan in a quarry. It wasn't in Karnak in a tourist area, etc. This was where millions of people every week drive past this thing. It's like the L'Étoile in Paris, if you've been there, with the Champs-Élysées in it. And then our guide, who you had set us up with, told us the story about all of the demonstrations that have, and all the 2 governments have been toppled since that was erected. And she actually got shot during that, and told us a really interesting backstory. And then I thought, these are contemporary. These obelisks are in modern settings. Most of them are. Then the fourth stop, and the one that was kind of put the nail in the coffin, was in Alexandria. And we were walking there are no obelisks there today, but there were a couple famous ones. And we were going to dinner in Le Metropole Hotel, which I think you know quite well, Gus. And it's right on the Corniche there. And Alexandria is so good. Many Americans don't go there. And I saw a sign, Castor, you and I saw, we took the elevator up to the restaurant, and there in the elevator was this sign. Feel the moment. You are standing at the same place of the Cleopatra obelisk, which was placed here as a tribute for her love of Mark Antony. Antony's my middle name, by the way. It is now located in Central Park, New York. Enjoy this experience and don't forget to take pictures. And there they have a sketch in that signage. It's a photo, actually, of Victorian men in Central Park erecting this monument. So I'm thinking, they're in the United States. And I kind of thought I heard of Cleopatra's Needles. But so anyhow, it took 4 stops, about 8 days. And at the end of the trip, I said, damn it, these are the oldest objects standing in modern society in the world. And they're a story worth telling. And I wanted to tell the story.
Yeah, I love how that came to be kind of throughout the trip, realizing more and more that you had this interest in this, I think fascination is kind of what it turned into with these monoliths that were created by the ancient Egyptians. But then the process and how some of them have moved around, and like the one in the center of Tahrir Square, or the ones that have gone abroad and gone to the United States or to England or to Rome, like you talk about in your book. So talk more about the book then. What does your book talk about, and what topics do you explore in relation to the ancient Egyptian obelisks?
Well, it started off as purely a fact-based, non-fiction history book. And it tried to do a couple of things. First, tell their story in Egypt and there's no book that's ever been written that I've been able to find that talks about all 26 obelisks that were quarried in Aswan that are still surviving today. So the first level was explain what happened in Egypt to create them. The second layer was, how did they get to where they've gotten all over the world? And as I looked at it and learned a little bit, they're fascinating. The whole way that they got there and why they got there, they're all different. That was fascinating. But what emerged as I was writing, it was a third level of interest. And that was, what do they say to a modern audience today? These are, as I say, 3,500 years old, some 4,000 years old, the oldest things standing in modern cities. And the New York of today is different than the New York of 1870 when it came originally to Central Park, which is where it is now. So what are they saying to a modern audience? And that's kind of an impressionistic thing, but I really wanted to tell that story too. And then finally at the end, and we can talk about this briefly at the end, it really then turned into the Odyssey. It's all about the experience of going around the world and trying to see them all. And it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So it really was some self-reflection that occurred toward the end.
And Mark, with your travels that you then embarked on, once you decided you wanted to visit every single obelisk that had been moved out of Egypt and placed in a different city around the world, when you visited all of these obelisks, is there one that stands out to you as your favorite, or is there one that you want to share about that you found particularly interesting?
Let me give you 2 quick ones, Gus, because they tell different stories. One, I would say, is the obelisk in Paris, because it's right on the Place de la Concorde. Many people go to Paris, they pass it, they're going to Les Invalides or somewhere else, and they don't even really think about it. But it's a tremendous thing, and it really embodies what the book is all about. It came from Luxor in 1500 BC. It fell over for more than 1,000 years, just laying there. Napoleon came in the late 1700s, 1799, started Egyptomania with the Europeans. His successors brought it to Paris. They put it where the guillotine occurred, so it's got a kind of a dark past, if you will. But it's got a modern story. And, there have been many demonstrations there since, some friendly, some a little bit contentious. On World's AIDS Day, they covered it with a condom, if you will. It's a kind of an iconic image, if you will, to kind of send the message of really what was happening in society. And then I was just there 2 months ago at the Paris Olympics. And this was after the book was finished, unfortunately. And they set up right around that obelisk 3-man basketball courts and breakdancing. And there, on the day I was there, Snoop Dogg was there performing. So think about the story, the arc of that story, from the Pharaoh Ramses II in Luxor all the way to Napoleon resurrecting it, bringing it all in a very difficult journey to Paris, where the guillotine was, and then all the protests that have occurred there since. And then it ends with Snoop Dogg in the Olympics and three-man basketball. That's the current voice. So that's one. And the second one I'll tell really briefly is there's a one that's nobody goes to see. And that's one of the reasons it's my favorite. It's in the countryside of Dorset, England. And it was the only obelisk ever owned by a private person, a business, a connoisseur, if you will. All the others were brought by emperors out of Egypt, and popes got involved, etc. But this was an art collector who brought it and put it, in essence, in his backyard. And it's a hell of a backyard. It's a beautiful kind of National Trust property, if you will. But what's great about it is he's got a great backstory, which I won't get into right now, but he was unjustly persecuted for a lot of different things. But what's also interesting is, like the Rosetta Stone, it helped crack hieroglyphics. And that story's never told. It was written in Greek on the pedestal, in hieroglyphs. And from the juxtaposition of those two things with the Rosetta Stone, they were able to crack hieroglyphics. So it's a code breaker, if you will, that really tells the story of how code breaking can be used, I think, for really understanding other people, if you will. And I go off on a riff in the book about where code breaking maybe isn't so good, where it alienates people, and we see a lot of that happen with tribalism today. And I won't get into that right now, but that's a particular favorite one for me.
I didn't know about that connection to the Rosetta Stone and to the deciphering of hieroglyphs until I read your book. So I really liked that reflection as well on that obelisk in Dorset. A couple other things that I just connected to when I was reading Obelisk Odyssey, something that I thought was really fun is that, Mark, you haven't been to 3 obelisks in Egypt, the one in Fayum, Oasis, that's kind of in the downtown center of the city, and it's the only obelisk with a rounded top, which is really interesting. And then there's one that's now in El Alamein that used to be on the island of Zamalek, and then the one that's over in Heliopolis. And I just thought it was interesting that I've been to all 3 of those. So we kind of complete, between all the ones that you've seen now abroad and in Egypt, and then those 3 that I've seen, we kind of complete the picture of visiting all these obelisks. Do you have plans to go back someday and to visit these last 3?
I'm about to contact you to say, can we set up another trip, Gus? Because when I decided to write the book, it wasn't really in Egypt. It was only after the fact, and we just happened to see 8 out of the 11. And as I was writing the book, I said, doggone it, I didn't see the other 3. So you'll get an email in a couple of days on that one.
Well, that sounds great. I will be ready for it. And before we wrap up, I got a question for all 3 of you guys. But before we wrap up with that, I want to know, Mark, you sent me a copy of Obelisk Odyssey, but where can people pick up a copy if they'd like to check out the book that you wrote?
It's available now on Amazon.com. It's on BarnesandNoble.com. I just learned that yesterday. And I don't know if it'll get into the bookstores themselves, but certainly on BarnesandNoble.com. And it's selected independent bookstores. And we're in the process of trying to see what the market is for that.
All right, that's awesome. So now folks know where they can grab a copy. I just love the fact that a couple of years ago, you 3 were contacting me to plan a trip, and then I bumped into you while you were in Egypt. And now here we are. Mark, you've written this book and done this Odyssey, visiting all of these obelisks and researching and learning about them and kind of thinking about the modern context that they're in. All these cities around the world. So I really appreciate you guys jumping on this call and talking about your experiences, and Mark sharing about your book. Before we wrap up, I have kind of a fun question that doesn't really have anything to do with Egypt, but it's related to travel. And Dana, I want to start with you. Where's next? Where are you going to be visiting next? What's next on the travel horizon for you?
Well, on Thursday, I'm flying to Elmira, New York for a comic convention. So I'll be there for the weekend, and then I get back, and then I'm going to Vancouver, Canada to go shoot a couple episodes of the, what do you call it? The spinoff I was on a show on Nickelodeon called The Thundermans, and I am going up to do some episodes of that for the new Thundermans Undercover. So I'll be in there. and then I'm going to my parents' house for Thanksgiving, and then I'm going to Mark's for Christmas.
All right, that sounds awesome. Castor, what about you? What's next on the horizon for you and your travels?
There's all kinds of travel that keeps happening. Since we did this trip to Egypt, I've been to Sicily, and I've been to Croatia, Montenegro, and so on. There are different kinds of trips that I take. I mean, the kinds of trips that Mark and I have taken together, where Dana has also joined, a whole different kind of trip. That includes our trip to Morocco, that includes our trip to Uzbekistan, other places. But then there's the family travel. So, that's a whole different kind. And Thanksgiving, we have all kinds of extended family descending on our home. And then Christmas, New Year's time, we're planning to go to San Diego and visit my daughter and son-in-law. So, but Mark and I are continuing to talk about, sometimes it comes together and oftentimes it doesn't, as to what's the next adventurous place that we want to go to. We have talked very, very briefly and kind of casually, perhaps going to Medellin in Colombia. Mark, you may remember that, or maybe
sure.
you know all about it. Still in the back of my head. Have to see if that can be brought together. By the way, Gus, I wanted to quickly make one comment about your help in planning of our trip. Of course, you guided us through the whole process, but equally important, you talked us out of a couple of things. We were thinking of a hotel in Alexandria, which would have been totally outside the city, some kind of resort, which would have been a total waste of time for us to stay there because we would have missed much of the city. And so you told us where to stay. And the other one was there were a few places that Mark had looked at through the tour books and so on. And you said, hey, do you realize that this is going to be like 4 hours going, 4 hours coming? You don't have time to do that. And so that was equally valuable, as much as guiding us through where we could go. And the fact that you were flexible and we had some ideas, I think it all really came together with your help in the best possible way. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. That's something that I do a lot, where people come to me with all the things they want to visit and experience. And Egypt's an amazing country with hundreds of places to go and to see and to explore. So sometimes the process is just whittling down where are the priority places that people want to see. And then, of course, offering advice on things like hotels and location and restaurants. That's what I love to do.
Yeah.
So Mark, what about you? What's next on the travel horizon for you?
Well, I learned something with your trip, the Egypt trip, and then the book follow up. I want to do that again. I want to go somewhere, learn about the area. It's a good excuse to travel, and then write some sort of a book about it. And what I've chosen for this next kind of round of travel is Hungary. And it's maybe an odd choice, but I'm half Hungarian. And so I want to learn more about that area. I just came back from Budapest, by the way, and I want to go again. But it's a very complex history there. They've lost a lot of land to surrounding countries. So there's a lot of Hungarians in Romania and Serbia and Slovakia, etc. And this one, and I just got back, and it's really fascinating, very layered history, very complicated, a lot of it not very happy. And this is going to be a fiction. This is going to be a mystery, if you will. And I'm honestly about halfway through with it. And I hope to pull it off, and maybe kind of do the same thing that I did with this one.
Awesome. So now I get to hear stories about travel to Hungary and then check out a mystery, a novel written by you. That's great. Well, thank you guys for joining and for talking about your experience working with me, your trip in Egypt, and then Mark, thanks for sharing about your book. And I hope that folks can have a chance to check out a copy of Obelisk Odyssey. If you do get a copy and read it, let me know your thoughts, write a comment below. Or if you have any questions for Mark about his journey exploring all of the obelisks in Egypt and abroad, leave a comment and let me know. And I will wish you guys safe and exciting and fun travels. And we'll hope to talk to you guys all again soon.